Hi everyone. Today we're talking about actuaries as content creators. How can social media help us to build our personal brands, as well as elevating the brand of actuary? What are some of the pitfalls when creating content and using social media? And how can we practically use social media to help us build our actuarial careers? Joining us for this discussion is the Maverick Actuary, also known as Dominic Lee. Dominic is an actuary, speaker, and content creator who is a globally recognized thought leader on LinkedIn. Born in Jamaica, Dominic now lives in the United States. And as well as his professional contributions as an actuary, he's leading a personal mission to maximize the impact and value of quant professionals on a global scale. You might have seen Dom's actuarial memes on Instagram or LinkedIn, or even tuned into his podcast, Live with the Maverick. But today, he's here to share with us his experience and reflections about content creation and leveraging the power of social media. Dominic, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Julia. Very warm welcome and happy to be here with a fellow content creator as well. Been looking forward to this.
Likewise, likewise. And like you said, Dom, we're both content creators and actuaries and podcast hosts. And I always love our time together, sharing notes and sharing ideas and tips with each other. So I'm especially looking forward to hearing your stories and tips about content creation today. But first, I want to ask you the question I ask all my guests. Dom, how do you use your actuarial superpowers to make a difference in the world?
Well, that's a great question and a timely question. And at first, like take a step back and look at the broader profession before I talk about how I use it specifically.
Sure.
As actuaries, I think our biggest superpower is bringing order to disorder. Now, I've heard people say before, bringing certainty to uncertainty. Similar idea. I prefer to articulate it this way. Now, how do we bring order to disorder? We do this by quantifying risk transfer for individuals, organizations, and institutions so that they can limit the downside and harness the upside of whatever activities they're engaged in. That's the challenging part is the quantification of risk transfer, as we know. So whether it's pricing an automobile insurance policy or pricing automobile insurance policies for individuals so that they can travel with peace of mind, modeling liquidity risk for banks so they can provide capital for small businesses or for small business owners, or designing systems that allow governments to provide sustainable service to its citizens. Actuaries play a vital role in society. And that context I thought was important to share
For sure.
because that's the premise for my participation in the profession and how I show up.
Mm.
So, as such, I use my actuarial superpowers to vocalize our capabilities as actuaries around the globe through content and help fill in critical gaps so that we can make the most out of those capabilities and better serve society. So that's how I think of how I use my actuarial superpowers.
I love that. Vocalizing the capabilities of actuaries. There's very few people who do that. That concept of brand actuary is I don't know about you, Dom, but even when I finished university, I still didn't really know what actuaries did. I'd learnt some actuarial science. I'd had a
Yes.
sense of where I might be working, but I didn't really know what actuaries did. And so, you're serving such an important role for the profession, but also for the community more broadly to understand what it is that actuaries do. And in fact, you're known as the Maverick Actuary. You call yourself the Maverick Actuary, which I love.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about what you do as the Maverick?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned when you started the profession. I think that's a theme that I see with many people in my community. I would say I was fortunate in that earlier on, even though I was actually, you may not notice, I was a chemical engineering major before switching to
Ah,
actuarial science.
right. Okay.
And yeah, and I always knew I didn't want to do something directly in academia. I wanted to do something more business oriented, practical,
Mm.
more of a traditional profession. So I started out in engineering, and then I happened to have a really close friend of mine when I decided to switch majors. A close friend of mine who was doing actuarial science. She never ended up liking it as much, but she introduced me to it, and that's how I learned about it. And also, I had a friend that older family friend from my swim club, 'cause I used to be a competitive swimmer, who
Right.
I remember was having a conversation at church one day, and she talked about not just actuarial, but she said that there's a plug in general insurance, property and casualty insurance as we know it in the US. And that's the area I always want to pursue. just given how dynamic it was.
Mm,
So I had some advantages in learning about the profession early on. Having
mm,
said that, just from observation, speaking to students and seeing some of the challenges with the profile of the profession, I think it's just been a real pleasure to be able to help fill in some of those content gaps. And I know we're going to talk about that in more detail further on. But going back to the Maverick Actuary and what that is and what I'm doing, essentially everything I do is around elevating actuaries and other quantitative professionals who, in my opinion, are often unknown or overlooked in society. More so regarding our skill set, not necessarily the specific roles that they do, because we're very diverse, whether
mm,
you're an actuary or other quantitative professionals, but more so in terms of the skill set and how we can actually apply that skill set and add value in various contexts. So the first thing I learned when I started studying actuarial science and taking exams is that the actuarial profession has very low transparency. We've already talked a little bit about that, but while there's been some progress, I still think the way that the profession is organized fundamentally, it makes it difficult for us to grow beyond a certain point. For example, something I've noticed is several lapsed candidates, and by lapsed candidates, meaning people who start taking exams and maybe have two, three exams, four exams, or who knows, they could be potentially be credentialed and not finished. They leave the profession entirely in some instances, and their quantitative skill set is either not utilized or underutilized. And as you know Kathy Lynn very well.
yeah.
Kathy Lynn and I had an excellent episode 98, called Quantitative Professionals, and just the whole idea of thinking of not just the actuarial space, but people who have quantitative skills and the need for that in society. So I think that it's unfortunate sometimes that folks, and I see it in my community all the time, people get into the field and they may get discouraged because they're not passing exams.
Mm,
And yes, I do get that that exams are there for a reason. We do want qualified actuaries, a certain amount of qualified actuaries in the profession, to be able to sign off on reserve opinions. Having said that, I do believe that there are some people who have talent in the field who, for one reason or another, they may not want to take exams. They may not be as good at taking exams, but I do think they can add value, broadly speaking, in the quantitative space.
mm,
So as a result, in my opinion, actuaries have historically leaned into opportunities beyond insurance, either because they aren't aware that those opportunities exist, either because or also because those who create opportunities may not be familiar with actuaries, or simply because actuaries don't have the mindset to create those opportunities themselves, which I know is a very high bar. I know being an entrepreneur or being more entrepreneurial is not for everyone, but certainly there's the potential to create opportunities as well, to think outside the box, embrace unknown, and take risk. So I think for a few of those reasons, the profession does have some challenges with growth and being able to, like I said, coming back to the first question, add the value that I know that we're capable of adding in society. So regarding Maverick Actuary, my activities help to fill in the critical gaps that I mentioned above, and I will categorize them in. I'm just going to kind of go very slowly into, maybe I try to group them into as small categories as possible. Came up
yeah.
with like 5 categories.
Okay.
So the first category of the content that I produce or create is thought leadership content on LinkedIn. So one thing I may actually want to do is take a quick step back. In terms of my career, there's a really big inflection point. I started off working in property and casualty at a top tier PNC insurance firm in the US. So I had a very traditional start. I did a rotational program. I know you have or have had at Guardian your development program. So we had that at our company. Did that for 10 years. And so I did different roles in 10 years, had a great experience there. But my inflection point was really the pandemic, and seeing, in my opinion, I don't mean to be specific here because I
Sure.
know I've been criticized for this, or been people have pointed this out to me. The UK, certainly from a pandemic response point, they were way ahead of the curve. Had people like Stuart McDonald
Mm,
and David Wilkie, who I just interviewed, Tan Suiche, who I've also interviewed, who have participated a lot in the pandemic response. But certainly in US, I could only speak for the US where I'm located. Never saw as much participation from actuaries and quantitative professionals, or most
yeah.
actuaries, to be honest. That's
Mm,
what
mm,
I'm more focused on. So at that time, I decided to start doing more content on social media, doing interviews, talking about actuarial science, and then talking about the actuarial's role in the broader society. And I did a TED style talk called Beyond Insurance, which is how a lot of people were introduced to me and my content, because that was a global thing that's on YouTube and people could see that globally. So going back to that first piece, thought leadership content on LinkedIn is talking about the actuaries role in society, where I think we can add value. What are some of the challenges from a development and skills perspective? So very big picture, kind of looking at things broadly, looking at very specific domains where actuaries can add value. So LinkedIn is the most important, more significant platform. I kind of jokingly call it the crown jewel of the Maverick portfolio because that's where I made my name, and I
Yes.
know that's most likely where we connected, Julia. I
I
would
think it
imagine so.
is. I think it
Yeah.
is. I think it's one of the things I love about LinkedIn is the ability to connect with actuaries that you might not have otherwise crossed paths with day to day. I mean, you and I are on other sides of the world. I mean, we were never going to cross paths in real life, but in on LinkedIn, I mean, we've been able to connect. And as a small profession as well, you know, you talked about some of the challenges that we face in terms of transparency. You know, one of the biggest challenges I see is that we are a very small profession. And so, you know, just in terms of pure numbers, how do we get ourselves out there? And we don't talk to, you know, we generally work for companies and provide services for companies, not necessarily for individuals. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think LinkedIn's a great way for us to connect on an individual level and also raise our brands.
Yeah, and I think going back to that point is another thing I'll mention is, well, it comes back to the system, and I see with my community, I'll get to Instagram in a second,
Mm,
but I see with my community as well is they're very focused on exams,
yeah.
when they leave school as they have to be, and ultimately, if you're not careful, you have your head down too much, then you kind of see a more narrow view of the world. I certainly, in the first few years of my career, was only seeing that narrow view, but
Mm,
understandably so. It takes you a while to figure out how to navigate. That's why the one of the best parts of what I do is being able to give back. And what I like to do is help to explain and articulate how to navigate the profession from an early point when people are students before they even start working, whether it's students or early career. So that brings me to the next thing that I do is Instagram is a platform that I'm on as well. I'm on all the social platforms. I'm going to talk about the most relevant ones.
sure.
Instagram is one that I've been on for probably was the second one after LinkedIn, and it's more for the younger crowd. That's where you're going to see. That's where originally a lot of the memes and some of the younger, fresher content, more relaxed content that you may
Hmm.
not see from an actuarial society or a more established organization. But one of the things that, and I experimented with several different forms there, but the thing that stuck was I did Q&A on Instagram story. And what I was able to do is help students as they're navigating the profession. Like I would do it like typically bi-weekly and sometimes weekly, get questions from people. So you get a variety of questions on exams, how to prepare for exams, how to think that through, how to, manage life, work, exams. I shared my personal stories. People ask me about challenges with bosses. I've had a lot of those stories myself as well. Um, you know, Asking about programming, how much you need to know, like lots of things that you need early on in your
Yeah,
profession to navigate, to learn to navigate that. So I try to share a lot of the experience that I didn't have on day one, but I've learned to
yeah,
help give people a head start. And some people take advantage of it, and surprisingly, Julia, some don't. But you can only do so much. So
that's
Q and
true.
A, yeah.
That's
So yeah,
true.
so
But
exactly. Have you had that experience too?
well, I was just going to pick up on the engagement aspect of that because sometimes people think social media is just about, you know, pushing your cause or getting your message out there, but you've used sounds like you've used it, and I've seen you do this on LinkedIn too. Sounds like you've used Instagram as a an opportunity to start a discussion and to hear what people need and to hear the challenges that people are facing and to be able to use those to address them. You're not just out there, saying what you think needs to be said. You're actually really taking into account what people need.
That's absolutely true, and it's been a very singular experience. I mean, other than I just think being a content creator is really cool because you have a lot of latitude. Of course, you still have to manage your brand, and especially for someone like me as an employee, you have to be respectful of that to a certain degree. Thankfully, I have an employer who, it's a very synergistic situation, so they like me being out in the public. So I may not have to be as restrained as other people, but to your point, one of the nice things is that you get to hear, and like I said, it's not like it was even necessarily intentionally, just unintentionally, incidentally learning about what some of the challenges are for younger people, analysts. typically those are most of the people who really would send me messages. I definitely interact with more senior people, usually more so in comments, and sometimes we may go offline and have meetings. A lot of people do want introductions and stuff, but just being able to have my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the profession, I think it's a very unique position. I
Definitely.
feel confident that not many people can say they have that experience, and that's why they like having me on panels.
Yeah.
When the CAS and some of those organizations and young, other student organizations have things that, I'm one of the first people they ask, because I have a very singular view, not just from communicating and interacting and starting the conversations, but through the podcast now that me and you have done now, second episode. So speaking of podcasts, so that's the third thing I was going to mention is, again, kind of calling back to the big content gap within the actual profession. Um, you know, I'm not quite sure what your perspective is in Australia, but certainly from a US perspective, or originally me being in the Caribbean, it's very hard to find information on actuarial science. And yeah, you can find what the exam syllabuses are, you can find the source material. But if you're interested in a topic, chances are you're going to find a very highly technical paper that's talking about theorems and proofs, and not going to be very helpful from a practical perspective. So I thought that was a huge content gap in this space, and that this podcast could help to fill that, and also be symbiotic, help me to learn as well, and build relationships. So the podcast you mentioned, Live with the Maverick podcast, been going on for started in May of 2022, so just over 2.5 years, and we just recorded episode 102, and we have a few more for the
Amazing.
season. So yes, don't know how I did it that many in that period of time. I know we've had this discussion, but somehow it happened, and very grateful. And
I
we
don't know
talk
how
on,
you've done it either, Dom. I mean, because you put out an episode pretty much every week, right? And I
yes.
just I'm in awe of, and admiration about how you manage that, because this podcast comes out fortnightly and I have help. The hard, all I have to do really is, have the conversation with the guest. But, I've got Felicity who produces the podcast. I've got Elise who does the shorts, and I've got Ikra who does the transcript. So I've got, all these people helping, and even still I find a fortnightly cadence is challenging. But you're getting one out there every week. It's amazing. It's very impressive.
Thank you so much. And and we've previously spoken to it. Sometimes there's trade-offs with having a higher velocity. You might have to
Right.
compromise on quality here and there, but I still think overall, in the long term, I think I've been pleased with. I think the quality at least has met the baseline.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of what the content itself, just like I said, there was a content gap there, but fundamentally, we're using the podcast to provide education on few areas: so actuarial science, risk management, and advanced analytics. And we talk about things like leadership. So I interview actuarial presidents periodically, topical subjects. So we may get very detailed on, specialized topics like reinsurance, catastrophe modeling, or may talk about a specific line of business,
Mm.
whether that's within property and casualty or health versus PNC. Regional episodes, we talk to actuaries on different continents and how actuarial practice varies from one continent to the next. Career development episodes, and also on what I call dynamic environments, so more actuaries in non-traditional roles like people in the media, sports analytics, energy, just very non-traditional things. So that's a podcast. And then there's a couple more things I'll mention. Public speaking, that's very instrumental to what I do. I kind of started off, I guess, in my career getting a lot of attention with the TED Style talk I did, Beyond Insurance, which is on YouTube.
I've seen
But
that, and
since
we'll
then,
link to that
yeah,
in the
you've
show
seen,
notes. It was a great, great talk.
like, oh, glad to hear you liked it. But the whole idea of that, again, is just in response to the pandemic and thinking of our role in the broader society. So that was really I think, in some ways, what galvanized the whole movement.
Mm.
But the speaking portfolio has expanded. I consider this, for instance, to be a form of speaking, certainly being interviewed, being on panels, giving solo, doing webinars at times. Even in my company, I recently did a webinar for our products. That's something that is not uncommon for me to do. Speaking at like I said, conference keynotes. That's probably the most important. Now, the one that I'm
Yeah.
trying to get as many paid gigs as possible. I've done a few and still looking for more.
Okay.
Speaking to actuarial organization. So, have done speaking engagements with all the three societies: IFOA, SOA, CAS, and education institutions. Have done talks for like actuarial clubs at colleges in the U.S. And those opportunities are good as well. And then finally, I'll just mention again, just to recap what I do, with regards to Maverick Actuary. we could probably have to have another podcast on my day job. That's we won't talk much about that. That's in software pre-sales. But in terms of the last thing to recap from a Maverick Actuary perspective is I've actually recently started rolling out services, but more on us more for special projects. So I have a website, but I don't have a way for you to go and just like add it to your cart. But if anyone is interested in a few things I'll mention, social campaigns, influencer marketing. So social campaigns would be essentially, like doing like a 90-day campaign with an organization that's aligned with and shares my values, being able to help to spread their message to accomplish very specific goals over a prolonged period of time. Right now it's like 90 days what I'm proposing. Influencer marketing, so doing like joint posts, and then like I said, other partnerships and collaboration around social. So like I said, I'm open to doing that on a limited basis, on a special basis, if anyone is interested. But like I said, that's just something that's very early. I'm very early in. So that recaps the,
Wow.
I guess, the 5 categories of things that I'm doing through Maverick Actuary today.
Wow. And you said you have a day job as well, Dom. It's a wonder that you managed to make time for that when you've got all of these other hats that you're wearing. So you've got LinkedIn, you've got Instagram, you've got, and a weekly podcast, you've got speaking gigs,
Yeah,
and also open for special projects too. So very, very busy you are.
yeah, busy.
So, okay, so lots of different activities under the brand Maverick Actuary. Talk to us a bit about the Maverick formula. What is that?
Great question. And we talked a bit about gaps a few times. I mentioned the gaps that I saw in the profession. Well, I more specifically talked about content gaps, and that's a more of a subset. But when I look holistically at the broader profession, I would say that the formula incorporates the biggest unaddressed gaps I've observed in the actuarial profession. So I'll talk through what the formula is in a second.
Yep.
So on the left-hand side, I talk about the biggest unaddressed gaps. On the right-hand side, it's the two keywords for the brand mission. So essentially, I'm saying if we solve some of these gaps, then we're able to accomplish the mission.
Right.
So on the left-hand side, when we think of the formula, it's media plus story plus strategy. Those are the biggest gaps that I've seen. Before I get into those, I was going to say that everyone knows actuaries are known for being mechanically technical. So one of the things I observed was that I didn't think that that was something that needed. I mean, we can always be better technically. We can always be smarter with technology. And in fact, funny enough, in my day job, I'm helping insurance companies to modernize the technology. Again, different problem. But
Mhm.
in terms of the things that I would the gaps that I was very passionate in terms of addressing, 3 of them. So the first one is the issue of name ID. I think the sorry, let me just repeat the formula one more time just so we
Yep.
stay on
Yep.
track here. So the left side of the formula, media plus story plus strategy is equal to impact plus value. So like I said, let's
Right.
break it down. So starting from the left with the media piece,
Yep.
what the media is addressing is, in my mind, a challenge that we have with name ID.
Name ID.
Now, name ID. So when you think of the example I always use is a political campaign. Whenever someone's running for office, the first thing they want to do is to increase their name ID. So they're running commercials, they're putting themselves out there, they're sending emails, texts, and can be very obnoxious. People in the US know what I'm talking about because we have an election here in 2 weeks. But that's what they have to do because no one's going to really trust you. They don't know who you are to begin with. And I think most people, or in the broader society who don't work directly in insurance and risk management, may never have heard the term actuary, so they don't know who we are. So by using media, so that's the word, media there, intentionally is helping to address that gap, to make us more visible. And I think it's a particular problem. It's something that frustrates me at times because even when I see some of the leaders of the organizations, the presidents, some of them, it varies. There's some, certainly to their credit, like Tan Suiche we spoke about before, certainly is a public figure in Asia and has been more visible and vocal on the IFOA side. But certainly in North America, historically, I think the presidents have tended to be more, in my opinion, to be more low profile. So I think the message about what we're doing and who we are is just really not getting out, just because profile is just way too low, in my opinion. So that's the media part. The second word I mentioned on the left of the formula is story. Now, what that's addressing is the challenge in my mind with having an explainable value proposition. So when you ask even actuaries, you ask 2, 3 actuaries what we do, you may get 3 wildly divergent answers. And sometimes we have problems even explaining just what we do in a very succinct way that in simple terms that someone who's not necessarily in the profession can understand. Certainly, presentations I've had are a dreadful experience sitting through presentations, both at my employers and at conferences. You could probably think of the presentations loaded with words where you didn't have even any white space, words and too many pictures, and it just, you know, information dumping. So certainly helping actuaries with storytelling skills to tell more compelling stories. So like when I do my presentations, they're very intentionally designed, and they're meant to be engaging and to tell compelling stories that people can remember, because people tend to not remember very many things, to be honest.
Mm,
So
mm,
that's a story piece, and then the third piece is strategy, and that's around, in my mind, I think the profession could be better at having, or people in the profession could be better at having a strategic mindset,
mhm.
and that's around, in my mind, that's around looking at the broader risk management picture, the broader picture that includes risk management before you just narrowing things down with insurance. That's how you get to identifying opportunities in wider domains. So it's all about the strategy part. It's all about having a strategic mindset, helping people in profession to develop that. So we mentioned media story strategy on the left, and if all goes well, that leads on the right to impact and value. And you mentioned, Julia, earlier on the my mission of maximizing impact and value on a global scale. And why those two are important, those words may sound similar or related, is I think that you can have impact without having value. There's a lot of people on social media, for instance, not necessarily in the profession, just in general, make a lot of noise, but they don't necessarily add a lot of value in my mind, whether it's a society or just very specific spaces, but they're just noisy. And then on the other hand, value, you can have people adding a lot of value. And I think actuaries are great examples. People add a lot of value, whether it's to a company or, to an organization or something, but they may not have as much impact because just nobody knows, not enough people know about the work that they're doing. And to your point, with it being B2B, sometimes that's challenging as well, not being in a B2C, people facing, or I guess it's a consumer facing profession. So
Yeah.
that's the formula. Like I said,
That's a great formula. So, if we can use media better to increase brand actuary, and if we can um, also leverage the storytelling, which I don't think actuaries necessarily know how to do. I know I spent a lot of time talking to actuaries about how to explain complex actuarial concepts using analogies and stories. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of time and practice. But it's very powerful, as you said, because our brains remember stories. And then if we can also think a bit more strategically, putting all of those together, that will increase our impact and our value as a
and the
profession.
strategy as well, real quick, Julia, the strategy to putting it together certainly is more, like I said, is more about the domain view, is looking at how our skills can be applicable and transferable. So not just
Mm.
looking at it as, okay, I can be either a pricing or a reserving actuary, but my skills may be applicable in cybersecurity or something, a much broader domain that's not limited to only
Yep.
insurance. One more thing I was going to mention when you go back to the media, I actually had this very specific example here. Is it kind of made me chuckle, is like there's one of the society, like I said, I have good relationship with societies, but I'm just being honest here. I looked
Yep.
at a video that they released. It was a few years ago. It's not a brand new video. It was on YouTube, and it was two fairly senior people, I think, like someone who was president and someone, I think, who, if not president, they were an executive or something. And I think the video had less than 100 views. And I was thinking, they already have the benefit of being an organization of a particular age. So the fact that they're not able to reach people beyond a certain point just shows that there's so much opportunity that there is when you
Mm.
think of content and how we're doing content in the space.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about that a bit more, Dom, because I think that's really important. It's easy to think, oh, we could just be on social media more, but it's not just a matter of showing up. There are pitfalls. There are things that don't work, and you've been doing this for a while, as have I. And I know we probably learned a lot organically through our own experience. But what are some of the common pitfalls that you see actuaries falling into when they're trying to build content or maybe build their brand on social media?
That's an excellent question, and I would say that there's two types of pitfalls. There's fundamental pitfalls, and then there's mechanical pitfalls. So the fundamentals is the one I want to focus on. It's just the foundations
Mm.
before there any others. The mechanical pitfalls are more how you format your text and how you design things. That's a little bit more advanced. I think if you don't have the foundations, that's more of a moot point. So
Yep.
we'll talk about the fundamental pitfalls. The first one, I kind of go through this again sequentially. I'm very list driven like an actuary.
We're actuaries, Dom.
I know, right? It's the one I call, and again, I'll talk. Yeah. I'm actually like excited to share or eager to share some of the stories that you may not know.
Yeah.
So, like hierarchical mindset. That's the first one. It's having a hierarchical mindset.
Hmm.
No, it's not surprising. As actuaries, we're used to a very graduated system. The person with two exams makes more than the person with one.
Hmm.
Person with number of experience is more likely to be a fellow, and then associate fellow. And then we have titles, of course, manager, director, senior actuary, so chief actuary, whoever. So we're used to, I think, in this space, that hierarchical mindset of things being correlated with years of experience and credentials. But when you go into the content space, what you learn is that people honestly don't care about that. Like, yes, certainly there's a correlation with credibility and credentials, perhaps years of experience. But as you're posting, you learn, like, people, and I think I explained this to you in the pre-meet, Julia, is that people are getting what 1,500 pieces of or so of content per day, or I think it's per
Hmm.
day, in various forms. Some of them could be really short, it could be like a reel, tweet, etc. And they're already stressed out at work. They're so used to taking orders from someone. Most people are not CEOs and chief actuaries, so they're so used to authority figures and having to conform and be nice to them, and be supplicant in some ways. But when you come on social, it really is a level playing field. It's just, honestly, I think, even though we're living in a world of algorithms and those can be deceptive at times, I think the people who do produce better content tend to get better engagement for the most part. There's certainly some
Hmm.
exceptions of things like sensationalized content, but you do have an opportunity. Like I said, it's a much more level playing field. So when you go in, or if you happen to go in with that hierarchical mindset, you might be frustrated. And I'm not going to lie to you, Instagram was very humbling for me, because when I went to Instagram, Julia, my premise was, okay, I'm coming in and this is the best spin in the world. Like, I'm coming in, I've been in the field for 10 years. I'm going to talk in these videos to you about all the things I learned and the mistakes I made, and I'm sure they'll just eat this up. What happened? People never really bit on it. Like, this is when I used to do. Initially, I was doing some shorter videos on Instagram, maybe like 2-3 minutes, and it never really caught on. And some of it is just because people's attention spans, it was too long for their attention spans. It wasn't engaging or entertaining enough, even though the information was good. So
It's so hard though, isn't it? And you put yourself out there and you create this content, you do these videos and have your setup and everything, and then you put it out there and it just doesn't land in the way that you're expecting. And it's yeah, it's
yeah,
quite can be quite off-putting, can be quite discouraging.
it can be. No, the nice thing with content is that it can always, well, if it's evergreen, if it's not very time sensitive, it can be repackaged, repurposed. I certainly plan on going back to some of those videos, even though they're 2 years ago, because I think some of the lessons are still relevant today.
Mm.
So, but that's something I had to learn, is that just because I came in thinking, okay, well, I have this experience, so I expect you to see me as an authority figure. But that
Right.
wasn't the case. Some of it too was because people, quite frankly, just didn't know me as well, and there's the issue of temperament. Some people may take to your temperament more naturally than others.
Yep.
So that you have to be very open minded when it comes to that, and not just go in with that hierarchical mindset of this level. Because you've been in profession longer than they're going to listen to you.
Mm. You
Believe
don't have
me,
that automatic authority. Yeah.
you don't have automatic
Yeah.
authority, and that can be very humbling. And it certainly was for me, and even till this day, something I have to manage. So
Mm.
that's the first one.
Okay.
The second one is what I call lack of intentionality. And it's what that means is not having a why, not having a central theme, a spirit. No, don't get me wrong, I might be a bit biased. With Maverick Actuary, I've taken all the time and effort to flesh that out. So my purpose mission might be a bit more developed than others. But even if it means that, let's just say I'm going to pick someone who's different from me. Let's just say if you're into predictive modeling or something like that, or building tools or something, and that's your passion, that gives you a central focus. And when we think of Simon Sinek, start with why,
Yep.
is, so for me, like I said, for my content, it's elevating the role of quantitative professionals in the broader society. So that everything I do in some ways relates to that. So
Mhm.
whether it's on a similar scale or a smaller scale, having, having that theme is good. So being more intentional.
Yeah, being
The
intentional, knowing your purpose. Yep.
yeah, the third thing is what I call sharing information instead of insights, or sharing information versus sharing insights.
Hmm.
A lot of people will come on LinkedIn, and more so this more so happens on LinkedIn. They'll come and they'll share an article, something they found interesting, or even something they worked on. It could be a research paper that they worked on, and they say, "Oh, I worked on this," or "My colleague and I did this. Here it is," and then that's it. you know, so
Yeah, yeah.
essentially just yeah. Sorry, you had something to say?
No, no, no. I was just agreeing with you that, and back to your point about, if we're bombarded with 1,500 pieces of content every day, if someone just posts, oh, here's an article and you've got to click through and read the whole thing, I mean, you don't know why you're doing it. So they've got to give you some reason to read it. But it's a shame because so much work would have gone into that. But with a little bit of, as you said, intentionality and a few bits of here's what's in this and here's why it's interesting and here's what you'll get out of it. How can you expect to grab people's attention?
Exactly. You need to add something you need to add something original. You need to add the context, not just tell
Mm,
people what the data says, but why it
mm,
matters, who is affected, etc.
mm,
I actually got
mm,
someone told me this was actually someone who works in content marketing, and he worked. I won't say the name of the company. It's a well-known organization, but I think they're in Europe,
mhm.
some in the insurance space, and they produced a white paper. I think it was over 100 pages. And the reason that they came to him is they said, okay, we spent 3 to 4 months working on this white paper, produce it and it was good research, I'd imagine, very detailed insights.
Mm.
And then what they did is they went on LinkedIn and posted it and said, here, hey, it's available. And of course, nobody looked at it. And he had to explain to them that there's a place for white papers, certainly in business, but when you're on social, the platform matters. So you have to be able to break it down, make it, he called it snackable, making it digestible
Snackable. I love
easily.
that. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, in a
Mm,
sense that's what me and you certainly probably do it more frequently and do a better job at it, is like with our podcast breakdowns, is when
mm.
we post those clips of 30 seconds to a minute,
Yeah.
that's digestible. Someone can
Yeah.
get a sense of the episode and they can get a better idea of whether or not they want to watch it. I think that's the part that's often missing. So,
Absolutely,
like I said,
absolutely. And
you need
and
to
that was
share.
something I
Yeah,
had to learn as well, Dom. I mean, I didn't do that right from the start. It took me a while to think, I had these 30-minute episodes. I thought they were amazing. I had these great guests. I had loyal listeners, but then wondered why I wasn't getting traction. And I think it's because if you post, oh, here's a link to a 30-minute episode or a 60-minute
yeah.
episode, well, that's not everyone has time for that. But if you can break it down and take those little snackable bites out of out of the bigger
Yes,
content,
exactly.
makes it much more accessible for people.
Exactly. So, and like I said, you do a good job, and I've always known that to be true. But sometimes this is an issue of bandwidth for me in terms of break. But I'm going to try to do a better job at breaking my stuff down. I mean, more so the podcast. The short form stuff obviously speaks for itself, but
Mm,
in terms
mm,
of long form, it's very imperative to break that down. And
mm.
like I said, just beyond that, just be like whenever you post something, it's not social media is not just for information dumping. It's
Yep.
people want to know why and what do you think. They want to know your perspective, but they just want to know. It's not like the news. We already have the news. We already have organizations like that. But as a
That's right.
personal, someone building a brand,
Yeah,
what like
absolutely.
what do
And
you add to it?
Dom, I think you do that well with your memes as well. You couldn't build a brand just on memes, but by having
Right.
memes as part of your brand, that's a very
Yeah.
quick, easy way for people to get to know you, what you stand for, and
Right.
to show your human side as well, and to engage and to be entertained sometimes, and to build that community. So,
That couldn't have been a better opening to what I was going to say next. I was going to say the next one is not being relatable.
right.
People oftentimes they'll come on, and I think this is in some ways related to the first one. It's like, okay, you think just because you're a leader in your company, everyone knows and respects you, or you think they do. Not being relatable. So not taking the time to introduce yourself
Mm,
beyond just your title. Who are you?
mm,
What are your values? What do you stand for? You're just people, sometimes just they speak to be heard, not to help or transform. They don't understand social cues. So it's like not being relatable. If people can't relate to you as a person, not just as a professional, but as a person on a human
mm.
level, then you're not going to have much success with the content. They're not going to watch it, listen to it, read it, and comment, share, etc.
Yeah. So how do you
Um,
do that?
I did it. I did it with and I'll talk about this a bit further in the interview with certainly personal stories. That's something that I started by doing. So I never started talking about actuarial at all. Like I remember the early days of content I was talking about like my weight loss journey
Mm.
and some of the, I was doing like marathons and stuff like that. Just things that were very and easily relatable. Another way I did it too, which honestly there's a bit of vulnerability involved too, is I talked about challenges with passing exams, which I think a lot of actuaries have more so
Mm.
than some more so than others, but people
Mm.
appreciated the vulnerability and it just made it very relatable. People
Mm.
oftentimes, as you're seeing, showing only the successes, whether it's exams, promotions, university degrees, but they
Mm.
never talk about the challenges. So that's something I used to differentiate myself. And
Mm.
I thought personally, people told me that it made me more relatable, and I would
Mm.
agree.
Yeah, it does. I agree too.
And then there's just two more I want to mention. This one might be my biggest pet peeve is speaking in a company voice versus your individual voice, or in your own versus in your own voice.
Hmm.
I actually did an article about this on my website on the story section. I think perhaps you'll link that in the show notes.
Sure.
And I talked about the importance of having a personal brand that stands alone. Now, oftentimes you'll see people, and some of it, to be honest, I'm not trying to criticize people, but maybe it's because they're a bit nervous. It's much more comfortable to hide behind a company banner. So if your company page posts an article, like the most common one I always talk about is, people reposting the one that, oh, I'm so proud to work at a company that was number two or number three on the best places to work for. Right, completely subjective, not really based on much objectivity.
Mm.
A very a tidbit that you may not know. Certainly, at least in the North America, that's how it works. Is like a lot of these lists are driven by surveys, and
Yeah.
the people who there's like an implicit bias in my opinion, because the people who are more likely to, or the people who have a favorable opinion of their company are more likely to be treated better, and the people who
Yeah.
don't are most likely to just ignore the survey. So
Yeah.
those things are very meaningless. But the broader point is to have a brand and a voice of your own, and not only talk about. I'm not saying you should never talk about your company. Like, of course, there's cases where you may want to hire someone for a role, or you're at a conference or something. That makes sense. But in terms of the day to day, you need to have a voice that's separate, because your personal brand needs to be portable from one company to the next, or one institution or organization to the next. Because
Mm.
as we know today, roles don't necessarily last forever.
That's right.
Certainly, you have people who stay at one company, but there's no guarantee, especially in a world where you have this much turnover and volatility. I think
Mm.
it's important to have a personal brand that's portable.
Yeah.
And the last one I would say is just simple. It's not showing up. You probably heard the statistic. LinkedIn has over 400 million users, and roughly 1% of them are active. And when I say active, like consistent in terms of posting, consistently posting. So if you're not showing up and if you're not posting, that's a huge missed opportunity. And that's the easiest
Mm.
one. You just have to
Mm.
show up, showing up to the line, and you're in the 1%.
Yeah, absolutely. And even engaging too. I don't know about your network, Dom, but I often find that I'll have a conversation in real life with someone who will say something to me like, "Oh, I loved your post on this," or "I loved your episode on that." And I was thinking, I didn't even know we were connected on LinkedIn because you never engage with my posts, you never comment on my posts, we never chat on LinkedIn. I've almost forgotten that you were even watching. So I think there's this huge pool of silent observers on LinkedIn as well. And I
I,
think that's a missed opportunity.
it's very true, and that's interesting, because the same person, I won't mention his name, but the same person who I mentioned earlier, who worked with the that client who did the white papers, he actually has talked about this in a podcast. Says that he calls them like the silent community. There's certainly a group of people who are silently observing your
Mm.
content. They're not engaging, liking, commenting, sharing anything. And I don't know if it's a psychological thing, but I just think if you think of content and engagement, it's like a new form of communication.
Yep,
It's like not quite speaking, but it's like a more modern form of communication. And I think people
absolutely.
are still wrapping their minds around that. And the one thing I've seen, and certainly was his observation, is that it takes a while to get people's trust in terms of them taking that additional step to engage. Like I said, I don't really know why. I think one very clear example, which I certainly think affects me as well, is how you train the algorithm. So there's time, not just how you train it, but there's articles that, let's just say, if they're provocative, or like not necessarily provocative, but very direct, and they could be accurate. Like I follow an HR influencer. She was actually on my podcast, Robin Story, and she makes she
Oh,
has a
great
resume.
posts.
You know her, right? Right. She
I
has
do
excellent
on
posts.
LinkedIn.
Exactly. She's like the queen of HR and LinkedIn, and she has, and the one of the biggest benefits she has is because she's seen hundreds of resumes per week, and and not just that, we're helping people with job searches. She gets to the real data, so she's very cleverly, very with wit and insightful wit, sharing these stories. And sometimes the truths are harsh. It's like things about people giving people homework assignments for jobs, and people hiring internally, and sometimes she used choice words, and I think it's appropriate, but maybe people don't feel as comfortable necessarily liking or commenting on that because maybe they don't want their employer to see, which I think is
Mm,
unfortunate. But
mm,
so there might be reasons like that where people just may not want to engage because they don't want people to be notified that they engage with it. So I think that's still very narrow, and that certainly like I go with that because there's some cases where I'd rather not. I may have a thought, but maybe I don't want to share it. But
mm,
for
mm.
the most part, when I find something engaging and positive, I will. And
Yeah.
I think people also don't know that comments. I will also mention comments are a form of content as well.
Yes. And
Especially
it's
on LinkedIn.
it's a good way to
Sorry, go ahead.
start. It's a good way to start. I think if you don't feel confident posting something, just commenting on other people's posts and start that's another way that you can start getting involved in the conversation.
Yes, and with the comments, I would think of it differently. It's not like on Instagram or Twitter or something, or no, maybe not Twitter, but like on Instagram or TikTok where you're
Mm,
just laughing and giggling. It's
mm.
there's an opportunity for you to actually, if someone does something, a thought leadership post, you can share your ideas, and then people might find you that way. A lot of people have
Yes.
found me that way because of
Yep.
comments I've made. So certainly recommend that people take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I guess that point about silent observers, I think that's also good to keep in mind if you are feeling discouraged that you've put something out there. If you're in your early stages of putting posting and nobody or very few people maybe like or comment on your post, remembering that there's actually a whole lot of other people that have seen it. They just have chosen not to engage, and it doesn't mean that it hasn't landed. So I think, yeah, trying to disconnect from the that dopamine hit of seeing the engagement as well when you're just starting out, I think can help.
Yes.
Okay, so that was so you've shared some really great common pitfalls, Dom. I wonder if you can just recap those for us before we talk about practical advice. So you started with, not sort of assuming authority.
Yep. There's a hierarchy. Yeah. So that having a hierarchical mindset, so not
Yep.
not assuming that you'll have authority. The second one is a lack of intentionality, is not being intentional in how you approach posting. The third is sharing information instead of sharing insights. The fourth is not being relatable. The fifth is speaking in a company voice versus your own voice, your own individual voice. And then the last one is not showing up to the line and not posting.
Great, great, great tips and warnings around some of those common pitfalls that we can avoid. So thank you. Okay, so my final meaty question for you today, Dom.
Great.
What practical advice could you share with actuaries who are wanting to build their personal brands on social media?
Great question. And I think this aligns very closely with what I mentioned before. So this essentially just addresses some of the pitfalls themselves. The first one, I just think of it in three words: strategize, personalize, and post.
Mm.
The strategy, in terms of strategizing, what you want to do is you want to identify an angle that aligns with your values. So focus on where you have the most meaningful experience and where you add the most value. I think an example I use in our pre-meet is if you're a student who's coming out of college and you're just starting, you don't want to be, and I don't think anyone would do this, but you're not going to be seen as a deep expert in actuarial science, right? Because you just
Yep.
started, but perhaps you've been through one or two internships, or you've been through 4 years of college and you're taking exams. So you can certainly, speaking to some of those experiences might be more appropriate or more aligned with your experience. But like I said, where you have the most meaningful experience and where you add value. So for me, for instance, I would say what I call higher value skills. So not saying the mechanical, technical, that's important, but higher value in the sense of people call them soft skills, but I prefer the term higher value because I think the soft skills undermines it.
Mm.
Things like communication, exercising influence, giving presentations, like those are some of the things like I focus on,
They're really
and that's where I
important
think I add the
skills.
value. So
Yeah.
this, like I said, the strategy is important. So identifying the angle and then identifying your target audience. Who do you want to speak to? Do you want to speak to, Yeah, and I'm not saying it's one or the other, but it could be a group. But who do you want to speak to if you're only focused on actuarial students? That's going to be a very different message from if you're speaking to executives or whether in actuarial or in other professions, software or somewhere else. So knowing who the target audience is, who you want to receive the message. And then
Mm.
the last thing I'll mention about strategies is the content form, the style, and the standard. So some people, like I said, I love memes are good for me. Like I do memes, in my opinion. I mean, it may not sound the
You
most
do a
humble,
great
but I
job.
think my engagement speaks for it. And you
Yeah,
mentioned it
for
earlier.
sure.
So I assume you weren't just being nice.
No,
But
no, I very much enjoy your memes.
yeah, so that form works well for me. That I would say
Yeah.
that and short form text on LinkedIn, those are probably the two that work the best for me. I don't really take other than my podcast, which I guess incidentally is long form video. I don't necessarily do a lot of 15 to 20-minute videos on YouTube. Some people do that, they do it very well. I'm not saying I can't do it, but it's not something that I've really enjoyed doing. And I just prefer the shorter form. I prefer to go for the low hanging fruit of attention span. I think
Yeah.
it's a better ROI for me personally.
I think it makes
So that
sense in today's busy
yeah,
world. Yeah.
yeah. But again, some people do go for the longer videos, and when
Mm,
you get people to watch those videos, they really become attached to your brand. So that
that's
can work
true.
as well.
Yeah.
This style in terms of how you come across, some people, and again, one more thing I'll mention: style too kind of relates to the content form, because every so often people will be like, "Oh, I tried memes," or maybe they'll see what I do and they'll try, and I'm like, "Okay, that's fine," but you kind of have to be funny. If you're not funny, that's fine. Not being funny is not common, and it's not something that a lot of people have, but it can go really wrong if you're not funny and you try to be funny. So, but that's just one example. There's other, like if you just be authentic,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
So in terms of form, what forms you use, a style, and then the standard. The last thing I mentioned is standard. So for me, I've always thought of Maverick Actuary as a content brand. You can see that in my design of my website, design of my flyers, everything. It's very consistent. I think, a bit more of a premium brand from a design perspective. Like I said, that's not necessarily a correct decision. It's just a decision I've made in terms of when I put my stuff out there, I want to be a certain standard. I've seen people do the opposite. I've seen people just do the bare minimum. They have a domain from GoDaddy.
Mm,
They're using Figma and some of the free tools, and that's fine. And they have way more followers than me, and who knows? And maybe they're probably making more money. So I think it just depends on what you want. So that's strategy.
mm,
The second one is personalization, is being able to have a brand that stands on its own. So going back to that example of speaking in your voice versus the company voice, again, I would recommend personal stories at some point to help introducing yourself. Because you want to build rapport before people listen to you. You want to be able to build rapport so they can trust you and they be more inclined to listen to you. Be very specific, less general. Uh, what that one thing I've noticed is that the people who find a niche on not just on LinkedIn but other platforms tend to do really well because people know why they're coming to you. They kind of know what your brand is about, and you're very clear on that. So very very more specific and less general. Find a lane that works, and I think that could pay dividends. I'll be honest, I'm not necessarily the most narrow. I do talk about a group of things, a few things, but I think people still understand the spirit of what I'm doing in terms of the role of actuaries and quant professionals in society, or I'd like to think so.
yeah, you've got a focused mission, and
Yeah.
everything sort of supports that mission in what you're doing. So you've got that intentionality, that purpose, that strategy.
Exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. And just be authentic, be yourself. People know if you're not being authentic, if you're trying to be something you're not. I'm not saying you shouldn't use GPT and things like that for productivity, but just if you're just using GPT, I've seen people do it to sometimes. It's funny. It's kind of amusing to me. I don't know if you've ever used GPT, but if you generate a response to something, they usually add these little emojis, these
Yeah,
rocket emojis. It's very obvious when you
it's
see someone
obvious.
just went to GPT, and I'm like, oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
and then the third tip. So I went to strategize, personalize. The third one is post. So try to bring value to anything that you post. You're kind of related to those insights. Lead with intention, not metrics. This one is important, especially in the early days. To your point, you made a really good point. There's that temptation to for that dopamine hit. You're looking every 2 seconds.
Mhm.
Honestly, I've gone through that and I've learned to manage it over time because I just post
Yep,
so much,
same.
and it's more curiosity. It's not necessarily like
It's just
for ego or
data. Yeah,
validation.
it's not
Just
personal.
yeah, it's kind of like managing the platform, but
Mm,
lead with intention instead of the metrics, or to lead with intention, not metrics.
mm,
That's going to bring you far because it's a long game. It's more of a marathon, not a sprint.
definitely.
Um, So in terms of posting, to think of how you want to do it. Some people go with scheduling. I don't really do scheduling as much, but I do batch sometimes when I get good ideas.
Mhm.
Think of how you could do it effectively. Try to capture the ideas. I take notes. So if I can't finish something, I'll make notes on things as the ideas come.
Yep.
That I found to be helpful. And then the last thing I'll mention on posting is listen, test, and iterate. So listen to what people are saying. Don't be afraid to try new things, and then based on the reception and based on if you're getting your message across, how effective that is, and you iterate accordingly. So those are three simple tips, I think, simple things, hopefully to remember: strategize, personalize, and post.
Strategize, personalize, and post. Such great advice and really practical as well, and really helpful, I think, not just for people starting out, but also for people who are already posting, just to remember how important it is to be intentional about what they're doing and that personal voice. I think that's a really important tip as well. We're building our personal brands, not just our brands as employees of the companies we currently work for. So, yeah, some great advice there today. Dom, thank you so much for your time. I've got one final question for you today, and it's this. What is one tip you'd have for actuaries wanting to become content creators?
I'm glad you asked this question, and there's so many ways I could have answered this question, but I think, and the answer, forgive me, may be simple or seemingly simple, but I think it's also profound and important at the same time, is don't worry about other people's opinions. At the end of the day, your content is for your community, because your community is curated based on what your mission is or what your goals are, who your target audience is, who, like I said, I prefer the term community than audience. I don't like using audience, but you know what I mean. People who you're aiming to communicate with. So yeah, what you're doing is for that community, not for the general public. And you're going to have trolls on, especially, there's probably less on LinkedIn, to be honest, because I think that they're afraid of the employers. But I'll share a personal story. You might have seen this too. There was actually a hate thread about me and a colleague. I want to say it was like I can't believe it's so long. It was almost 3 years, probably like 2 years ago. I came across it, and I was just, because I was testing the platforms, and it was on Reddit. The thing with Reddit is it's actually a very good platform for people taking exams. So I highly recommend it, and it's a good platform for to get information and to see what people are doing in the field, because people usually will volunteer information and share their experiences. The downside of a platform like Reddit is that people don't have to share their names, so they're on fake names and they're using avatars, so they don't share images or names, so they feel a little bit more freedom to be malicious if that's what people are there for. So you do have some bad actors on the platform. And I think at the time, I don't know exactly what, like, they were pretty much just attacking the content I was doing and saying I wasn't qualified and all this stuff, and saying that my exam results were fake and all this. It was ridiculous things.
Wow.
So, and that wasn't just me, it was another colleague I have who's a FCAS. I'm an ACAS, and she's a FCAS. And they were, she's someone who's just a devout Christian. And of course, being the authentic person she is, she incorporates her religion into some of her content, and they were mocking that.
Oh.
And I think what you'll find is that people become jealous when you're getting attention. Because I guarantee you, if me and the person weren't getting attention in the space, to no fault of our own, right? We're just putting ourselves out there. People choose whether or not they want to be receptive to it, and they happen to be.
Mm.
Um, so when you get in that attention, you can attract bad actors. And even honest, like I said, that was my example is a bit more specific because I've been in space for a while. But even if you're new, someone says something about your post, or if you don't, or if they don't like it, like you said, the metrics are bad, you could be discouraged. Well, ultimately, like you said, it's not about other people's opinions, it's for your community
Mm.
and in support of your mission. So
Gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that that happened to you and your friend Dom. And
yeah.
yeah, a good warning to all of us that these things can happen. And but then just to focus on our community and the people that we're serving, and to, gosh, it's not easy, is it? Comes with some risks.
Yeah, it does. And what I've found though is that once you're grounded, I mean, nobody wants to people to say mean things to them. I mean, I've had to withstand far worse than this trolls on the internet. But even in that case, nobody likes it. Nobody
No,
likes to
no,
people to be negative. It's not good for your
no.
energy. But once you're grounded, then it helps a lot. And what I've found is that I've personally just leaned into my longevity and into objectivity as well. It's like,
Mm.
I have very influential people in my network, not just people who I've interviewed, but people who I've built trust with,
Mm.
people who, converse with me regularly and seek me out for opinions sometimes. So
Yeah.
if you look at the objective things, then
Yeah.
the opinions of the few should not really dissuade you from moving forward.
No, no. And you've built your brand on doing the right thing. So you can sleep at night and know that you're happy with what you're doing. And occasionally there might be some noise around that. But
And one more thing, if you don't mind, I know I'm going a bit long, but if
of
you if
course.
you don't mind me just saying something real quick, is perhaps you have a similar experiences when you do content creation for so long. Another reason why, if I were to reflect on it, in the moment I shouldn't have felt that way anyways, is because a lot of people, because they're not content creators, they don't have the shared experience, they don't understand what goes into it, not just the thought and the time. But when I think that over a period now of like two and a half, not 2.5, maybe like 3 years now, but yeah, 3 years, I've answered probably over 1,000 questions on Instagram to students. Again, I didn't get paid for it. I did
Mm.
it in my personal time. There were times where I probably should have had more boundaries, and not been answering questions on weekends. But it's something I was interested in. I did it because I was already on Instagram, and I was like, oh,
Mm.
this is a good question, and I did it. But like, for me putting my time aside to do that, they're not doing that. Like, they're only doing things to benefit themselves, which is fine. Everyone has to work and support yourself and your family, but they're not spending their weekends helping somebody in Nigeria to navigate actual profession. So I like knowing that I have that track record, and even if they don't know what
Mm.
goes into that kind of, like you said, that makes me not care about their opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. Helps you feel secure in what you're doing.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Dom, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. This conversation and all of our other conversations that we've had over the last couple of years around content creation, podcasts, and everything in between. But thank you so much for sharing some of your lessons, pitfalls, and advice around content creation today for our listeners. It's been a wonderful conversation, and no doubt you've given a lot of food for thought for a lot of actuaries. So thanks so much for your time, Dom.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's been a pleasure. I'm looking forward to for us sharing this recording, and reach out to for anyone who wants to connect. Reach out to me. LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to contact me. You can also contact me through the website, but LinkedIn is probably the easiest. LinkedIn or
Great.
Instagram.
And we'll put all those links in the show notes too. Thanks so much for your time, Dom.
Thank you so much, Julia. Have a wonderful rest of the day.